Good afternoon. In the U.S., we've got quite a lot of history with free trade agreement verifications between the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, if you hear me use that as an example, as well as a number of other agreements. So what I'm going to go through today is really give you examples of what importers and exporters deal with right now in the U.S. So it's kind of real life. It is what U.S. Customs does on verification. So I would expect the exact same thing in this agreement. And one thing I'll point out as we go along, and I'll start it off, is you'll also find that the European Union is the kinder, gentler customs service when it comes to verifications. The U.S. approach to verifications is very, very different, not in a good way for those in the room. You will see that as we go along. They take a very different approach. Topics I want to cover today is just kind of what are the types of verifications that are done, the procedures, how they go about doing them, some of the common problems as an importer and/or an exporter, because there's two different approaches that customs uses and the parties they will look at. Some best practices that we've seen in the free trade agreement area, and then what are the results of that verification. So when it's all done, what are the possible results from both duties, penalty, potential, things like that. Okay, the scope. Right now, and I would expect it'll be the same under the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, there's really the first step for an importer is in a normal customs audit, which is that general importer audit I'm referring to. Customs will look at whether the importer had a certificate in their possession when they made those claims. Okay. U.S. Customs does not get certificates. You don't give them to the government when you make entry. You just flag the claim on the entry, either document or electronic transmission, really. And you keep the documents in your possession. So on a normal importer audit, that will be just a check off. They'll say, okay, you're claiming free trade agreement benefits. Do you have these agreements? Do you have these documents in your possession? They'll do some sampling. If they're in the possession, they stop. That is not a free trade agreement verification. Okay, that's just a normal importer step to say, as an importer, you're making a claim on an entry. Do you have the right support and/or document? So that's really all that's going on. It is not a free trade agreement verification. In the U.S., Customs, when they're doing free trade agreement verifications, they are separate audits. They're not part of the normal audit. It is a separate audit. The main reason for it, unlike in Europe, as we'll go through, you will find out that U.S. Customs is not averse to going to other countries to do their audits. And in most cases, that's their preference. So, and then what happens in the agreements, there are notification requirements. They will work with local customs to assist them in it. But that is why they're separate audits, because it is a separate process that goes on. When someone is going to have a verification, they will notify the importer. Okay? In the U.S., that is the party responsible. So as they select companies for FTA verification, and typically it's based on dollar value. So they will run reports on who are the highest dollar value claimants by free trade agreement. That's one of the criteria. There's some other criteria they use. And they will select companies for a verification. They'll notify the importer, you're going to have a free trade agreement audit. The first thing that importer better be doing is contacting the exporter or manufacturer, because Customs will want that's where the information is going to come from. Customs will start off with, in those verifications, requesting information from yourselves, if we're talking inbound into the U.S. There'll be questionnaires. They'll ask for documents. They may stop there. So if you provide them the information, they may just then do that work at the importer premises or their own premise, and not come out and do a site audit here. But they do that. And actually, if you look at, it's a little distorted in NAFTA because it's much closer. Between the U.S. and Mexico or U.S. and Canada, it's very easy for the U.S. to go do those audits. But we have seen in the other free trade agreements, they still will go to manufacturers and do verifications. So don't expect that just because you sent them information, they won't come and visit. So that is one of the things in the U.S. That they do quite frequently, is that they will notify and set up that they may come out. They may not commit up front whether they're going to come and visit, but they will do that. And they are very detailed audits that go on. What do they do? If you think about your free trade agreement process, that for you to certify a product, you need to get information from your suppliers, from your vendors on whether the materials qualify. How do you keep that information in your system? If you walk through the different steps that you're going to do, that is what Customs is going to audit. They're going to audit each one of those steps. The other thing to expect and probably communicate to your suppliers, it is very common for Customs to select some of those key suppliers and go audit them. So the fact that your supplier gives you a certificate or gives you a document saying, yep, yes, my product is a Korean origin product, you use it in your verification, Customs will ask certain suppliers for the same things they're asking of you. So they will dive down deeper into that supply chain to make sure the supplier has the right records so that your calculation is correct. That's a fairly normal step in the U.S. How deep they go really depends on what they're finding. Typically, they'll start with a smaller sample on the large vendors, see what's happening and whether or not they're comfortable with it. But it is something that they do on a fairly routine basis as part of the audit. So the material side of it, making sure your vendors are giving you the proper information is critical. So that's one, that you have the documents. Some of the other issues that'll come up, how do you deal with multiple vendors for the same part number? All right, so you may have half of your inventory of a part qualifies, half doesn't. How are you accounting for that in your system? How are you dealing with that in your calculation? A common issue that'll come up on the audits. They'll look at bills of material for products that are produced. For those of you who deal with bills of material all the time, in certain industries, if the bill of material changes only once a day, it's a good thing. Right? So how are you dealing with bill of material changes when you do an FTA certificate or calculation at the beginning of the year? It can be good for the entire year, and your bill of material changes every day. How are you dealing with that? You can capture it at the end of the year, but there needs to be a process to make sure you're capturing those things. So those are some of the, the steps that they're going to go through. They're going to want to know, how do you address that? Because that bill of material is dynamic. It's not a static bill in most industries. The financial records. They will want financial records to support the calculation. Now, depending on whether you're doing, I get my terminology right for this agreement, build up or build down, new language for us in the U.S. Depending on which method you're using is what type of financial information they're going to look to. If you're doing a build up, they're going to look to your, production records, your profit and loss statements, your general ledgers, trial balances. They're going to go through the different accounts, determine how, understand how you're allocating costs to the products. Are you capturing all the costs that you need to capture, et cetera, in that build up? In the NAFTA agreement, I want to just divert for a minute there because I think there will be something unique in the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. In the NAFTA agreement, related parties cannot use the equivalent of a build down. They have to use a cost basis test in the NAFTA agreement. So what's happened within the verification process, it's always been a cost-based test. They'll look at your cost records, and that's been the way they've done the audits. In the U.S.-Korea agreement, that's not a requirement. So you can use a build down. What will be interesting now in this agreement, the key question then becomes, if it's a related party, is that price acceptable from a transaction value perspective? Are we using the right basis? Is that an arm's length price? That's never been a question in a free trade agreement audit. Under the U.S.-Korea agreement, if you're doing a build down, it will be a question, right? Because the relationship can affect the calculation. So that will become an issue. It has never been an issue up till now in the U.S. So that's going to be a new issue, I think, that we'll face on verifications, where they're now going to start having to look at how that price is determined between the parties to make sure that it's the right starting point and a fair starting point for the agreement. So that's going to be something new I think we've never seen before in free trade agreement verifications. And the last point they'll look at is how do you do the reconciliation or the recalculation? And again, typically what you see is companies are doing that calculation at the beginning of the year. And from experience, typically it's done once a year. It's an annual certificate. You'll do it on your beginning of the year estimate. It sits in place during the year. And at the end of the year, you do a true up to make sure you still qualify. How are you going about doing that is one of the key audit steps. And are you doing it? From experience, we've seen a lot of people don't do that. You know, they just assume it worked in the beginning of the year, it has to work at the end of the year, and they just keep plowing forward, and that's not a good assumption. So those are kind of the key things customs will look at in the verification. It's really each step of your process they're going to audit and make sure that they are comfortable with what you're doing, the controls you have in place, and that the documents are present to support what you're doing. Okay. How does this affect importers and exporters? And I'm going to split importers and exporters because it's a very different obligation and process for verification. For an importer, I hate to say it's simple, but it really is. As an importer, I have to have the documents supporting my claim. That's it. That's really all I have to do. You know, I'm not going to keep the record. I'm not going to keep production records here. That's my producer's obligation. So the importer, it's a fairly straightforward piece of the verification. The problem is without the suppliers keeping all the records, the importer's claim is useless. But the importer piece is as simple as that. I have the document. I had it when I made the claim. Give you the having it when you made the claim is a big deal in the U.S. And I'm going to give you a little, and this is a true story. For those who still fax things, right, has little, or now even emails, has a little date on the top or the bottom of the document. The auditors will look at that date versus your entries. So if that was sent to you on February 1st, and you've been claiming since January 1st, well, you've got 30 days or 31 days that you did not have that document in your possession, which is a record-keeping violation for 30 days, and you're subject as an importer to a penalty. Okay. It's one of the things they look at, because it's a requirement under the agreement. If you don't have the support, you don't make the claim until you have the support. So, and it is something they look at. So that's something, little caution there to be careful about. Make sure that document is in the possession of your customer. That's why you'll see as that goes into effect, right, your customers will want it before the year starts. So if you're going to use January 1 as your starting date, they're going to want that document in December before the year begins. Otherwise, they have to pay duty and then get a refund later in the U.S. From the exporter-producer's perspective, there's a couple of different things. One, and I'll put this as a procurement or purchasing issue, is obtaining the certificates from the suppliers. And in my mind, for those who may be customs people within your organization, the obtaining of certificates should not be the responsibility of the customs department and organization. Procurement or purchasing is the one who deals with the suppliers. Right? It should just be another required document in the procurement package. We need an origin statement. It may say the product doesn't qualify. Right? It doesn't have to say it's a qualifying product, but we need documentation from the suppliers telling us what is the origin of this product under whatever we're asking them for. We may be asking them for 5 different agreements. That, in my mind, that should be a procurement responsibility. Right? Make it a requirement in the procurement package. The customs people are the ones who are then going to use it. But the ones with the contacts and the clout with suppliers is not the customs department in a company, it's the procurement people. They're the ones who have the clout and the control over the vendors. So that's one key, is making sure that that information is being obtained up front. And I'll kind of give you a quick best practice here, even though we're talking about that later. What we've seen now in the U.S., since we've had NAFTA for a number of years, is as bid packages go out to vendors, If they don't provide a certificate back as part of the bid is thrown in the garbage, and it is a disqualified bid. Okay? So it's become a process. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. In the U.S., under NAFTA and most free trade agreements, and actually under the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, you can do up to 1 year certificates. So it's not a shipment by shipment. So it can be a blanket certificate for up to a period of a year. It's really up to you what you want to do. Again, if we're talking, since we're talking the U.S. process, the common process is a 1-year certificate. So it will cover a year's worth of activity. So again, procurement has that key, build it into the process as you're looking at this. They're the ones who can get it. The other side of that is they need to factor in the free trade agreements when they're making buying decisions, because if they're going to change source of supply, right, and I'm going to give you an example in a second, that can change the downstream impact to a finished good. So if they're going to buy a particular component, say, well, I'm going to save 10 cents on this, it may disqualify the finished product. All right. So now all of a sudden the procurement decision needs to, or should, I'll say should, whether it need factor in how does it impact the finished product. And I'm going to give you a real life example. The numbers are that from a client example in a second. Customs department in the organization. You're the ones who are going to have the business process. How do I do the calculations? Right? That is the job of the customs function. Right? So they're going to take all those certificates that are coming in from the vendors. You're going to use either your cost or whether, again, build up, build down, whatever method you're doing, and be responsible for doing those calculations. Also, typically they're keeping the records, similar to the comments you heard from Yost. Record keeping is one of the big problems in the free trade agreements, is the records either weren't there in the first place, they weren't kept properly. It is a very common problem in the United States. And what happens in the U.S., and I haven't gotten through all of the agreement yet. I was trying to get through all of the different parts of it on the plane ride over, but even if it's not in there, at least from a U.S. company's perspective, there are record-keeping penalties in the United States, separate and apart from free trade agreement. So if someone didn't have the records they're supposed to have, so if they didn't keep that, 3 years from now, Customs is doing an audit, they don't have all the certificates, they can get a record-keeping penalty for not having the proper documentation, putting aside whether the product qualified or not. So it's really a two-prong issue in the U.S., and that record-keeping is really very, very critical from a verification process. And then that last point on a process to track certificates, as a general statement, sales and marketing departments should never be allowed to sign a certificate of origin. Right? Just ban it altogether. Never allow anyone in sales or marketing to sign a certificate. Okay? Someone who has knowledge must sign a certificate. Okay? If salespeople are driven off, they have to make a sale. Right? And from experience, and actually Customs will tell you this, because if they see a sales or marketing department signature on a certificate, it's a high-risk certificate, and they will go to the vendor in the U.S., that they'll sign anything to get the sale. And that is Customs' opinion. We've heard it. You'll hear it in seminars Customs auditors give, that if they see sales and marketing signatures, as far as they're concerned, the document is worthless. It doesn't mean anything. That's Customs auditors' statements. That is their mindset in the U.S. And from experience, I'd probably agree with them. So again, make sure within the company who can sign that certificate should be a narrow group of people that have knowledge of the claim. And the same goes when you're getting certificates. Back to if you're getting certificates and you're getting them from sales and marketing people, maybe you want to ask, do they really have the knowledge that this product qualifies? Does the salesperson have knowledge to all of their procurement records on where they're buying their parts, on their cost records, on how they're making the part, and they do all the calculations and they know that product qualifies? Probably not. So again, one of the steps on maybe looking at certificates you're getting from vendors, you want to apply that same critical eye, since, again, customs is going to do it, so if it's a potential issue, try to do it up front. Okay, this is the example I was talking about. Now this isn't so much a verification issue as a business issue. And this is a real-life situation, and I'll tell you the story as I go. So in this particular client, they had a FTA calculation. The price of the good when it was sold from Mexico to the United States, let's say, was $30. It qualified for FTA benefits. They paid no duty. If it didn't qualify, they would have paid 4%. So fairly significant savings from an FTA perspective. Again, you can do a certificate once a year, so this was done at the beginning of the year. End of the year, they do their reconciliation, finds out they don't qualify. They do some digging. Turns out one of the critical components in their process had been resourced. And procurement, they were saving a 50 cents, it was about a 10% cost reduction on that particular part. From a Mexican vendor to a Chinese vendor. So it changed source halfway through the year. And what are, for those of you in procurement departments, not picking on you, what's your goal? Your goal is to reduce purchase price, right? Get cost, piece price savings. If you can reduce piece price by 10%, you did a pretty good job, didn't you? Problem is that 10% reduction, that's 50 cents a unit, and one of these per finished good cost 76 cents because it disqualified the product for free trade agreement, had to pay $1.26 duty on the finished good. Was that a good decision from a procurement perspective? And I'm going to do this, and this is a discussion that went on with the CFO, the director of procurement, and myself. And the tongue-in-cheek response of the procurement director was, yes, it was a good decision. Tongue-in-cheek, half joking, using an expression, might not know what I mean, tongue-in-cheek. The reason he said that was he looked at the CFO and said, what do you hold me accountable for? Do you hold me accountable for this, finished good and what we pay, or do you hold me accountable for piece price, material cost? It's held accountable for material cost. So, story is you need to change what you're being held accountable for. So again, but from a verification perspective, this change of supply during the year is a very, very common problem. And there needs to be a process, and I'm not so worried about capturing the change at the end of the year because the agreements allow for you to say, okay, well during the year there was a change, we owe money, we need to write a check. That's perfectly acceptable. Problem was this check at the end of the year had 6 zeros on the end of it. The CFO was not a happy person writing a check that had 6 zeros on the end of it to U.S. Customs. Okay, so it was perfectly acceptable. There was no penalties. It was a normal process, but the company hadn't planned for it. So what happens is there really needs to be a closer coordination with procurement and customs within the organization to make sure if this is going to happen, that better be a negative in front and not a positive, right? So that's one of the issues that you face as you do this reconciliation at the end of the year is you can, all of a sudden, the product no longer qualifies because something was sourced to a non-originating country. Okay? And the idea is can you head that off and build in that process with your procurement people? And the answer is you can. Okay, back to our verification issues for the importers. A couple of things that come up on certificates for the importer. First one is classification of the finished product. This question comes up quite frequently in any free trade agreement scenario is what do I do if I'm the exporter, I think it's one number, my importing entity thinks it's a different number. And worse yet, what if you both have rulings saying it's two different numbers? What do you do? I'll tell you what I would think you do, is put both numbers on the certificate. Put the number you think it is, because that's what you're going to use on your export documentation. Also put the number that your customer is telling you they need to use. The problem with that is you have to do two calculations if it's two different rules. But the reality is there's no way around it, because if you give them the certificate with your number and the tariff number that they think it is something different with a different rule, they can't use the document. It's useless to them. If you just use what they're telling you, that can create difficulties for you here, because your system tells you it's one thing, but you're issuing documentation saying it's something else. So you may have an issue on a local audit here. So what we've recommended companies do is show both numbers. That's perfectly acceptable. So show what you think it is, whether, you put a designation, for Korea or export versus import, however you want to do it on the documentation, but show both. As long as both meet the test, you don't have a problem. Where you start getting issues is one meets and one doesn't. But that will just be a fact of life. There's nothing you can do about that. But that's a common issue that comes up, and that's the way I would control it, by having both of those numbers present. So it's very clear what you've done, and there's no question as far as the process, and to make sure that you did what you need to do. The obtaining the certificates, the reviewing them, the due diligence, kind of back to that point of who signed the document. Does it make sense that they had knowledge? Things like that. There's some basic things importers and or as the exporter, the certificates you're getting from vendors, some basic screening of that to make sure it makes sense. Does it make sense? If you're getting a origin statement from your suppliers here, and you're in any component part industry, electronics, automotive, really doesn't matter, and your supplier says, yes, this is wholly produced in Korea, it's wrong. The only things wholly produced under a free trade agreement are things growing out of the ground. Okay? So in certain industries, to say a product was wholly produced means you don't understand what the term wholly produced means in the free trade agreement. So if you see things like that, you need to question it, and probably the supplier just needs some education as to what those definitions mean, because they might not know. So, but those are some of the basic things you can do in screening those certificates to prepare for the audit, because those are the things the auditors look at. Under the NAFTA agreement, because there's a set certificate, there's a letter on the document that actually tells you that. So if someone says, yep, it's wholly obtained or produced, that's noted right on the certificate. And again, from an audit screening perspective, anything that's wholly obtained or produced, not worth the paper it was printed on, and customs will go back to those suppliers to verify. Again, it's a red flag for audit. So put the same types of screening steps into your process that customs will do, on the audits. The last point on the contingent liability, if the exporter can't support the claim, similar to what Yost said, is the importer is the one who's liable for duty. But we'll talk about some of the exporter issues before we're done, because there are also exporter issues under this. For the company here, whether, and this could again be as the producer for what you're getting from suppliers, as the importer of a finished good, the coordination with your brokers are critical. If you're the one who's controlling whether something qualifies or not, you need to be communicating to your brokers what they should be making free trade agreement claims on and what they should not, right? Then it's not their determination, it's yours, right? So whoever's controlling the records in the database, there needs to be communication with the broker, right? Because you can have the best system and process in the world and have everything identified. If you're not sharing with your broker, what good is it? Right, they're the ones who are filing the entries. They need to know what you know. So make sure that coordination with your broker is in place, so that they're making the right claims on your behalf, because you've shared the right information with them. Again, common problem that we see. Time requirements. Again, most of the agreements, this also has, it's a 1 year. You have a 1 year look back for refunds. So if you don't have the documentation timely, you can go back later and get it. if something went wrong, in that example with procurement, once they found it, they had to make a corrected declaration and pay the duty. You know, that's provided for in the agreement as well. If something changes, that's okay. You know, it's not negligence. It's not, you know, that's a fact of life in production environments, and it's acceptable. You just have to have a process to do the recalculation and tender the duty. And as the exporter, you have to have the process to notify the importers that this no longer qualifies. I thought it did. You had the certificate in the beginning of the year. Halfway through the year, something happened. It no longer qualified. You need to correct and let them know that. So you have that obligation to do that as the exporter. For the producer, same issue on classification on what you're buying from your vendors. No different than the finished good, right? Your classification and their classification needs to match. Otherwise, that the origin determination on the component level may be wrong as well. So that classification of components, materials through finished goods, and making sure that you either have agreement or show the differences is a critical process in the FTA calculations. The maintaining the origin of the components, again, we've said that's a critical piece to this, that you need to maintain it. You cannot assume because I bought it from a local supplier that it's Korean. Common issue in the U.S. I bought it from the guy down the street. It has to be U.S. No, it doesn't work that way. You need documentation supporting it. Does not matter. Applying the rules correctly. As Joost mentioned, some of the rules are very complicated. Some are real easy and some are not. If you have the easy ones, great. If you have the complicated ones, make sure you document what your interpretation is and how you're getting to the answer. And I'll say, don't assume that if someone's questioning it that they're right. Make sure they understand it. That's why you need to have that documentation as to why you got to that answer. If something's wrong, take corrective action immediately. Your vendors or your customers may not be happy about it, but the longer you wait, the worse it gets. So if you find out something changed, make sure you notify everyone immediately. We talked about the coordination with procurement and the completion of certificates. Again, should be a controlled process with a limited number of people. Some of the best practices, and some of these we've hit as we went along, is the maintenance of the documentation is critical. The audit trails are critical for the verification process. Central coordination and communication with customs. There should be a point of contact for verifications, right? If the verification is going on, don't have the auditors talking to anyone and everybody in the organization without one central point of contact being part of those discussions and knowing what's being discussed, okay? So not that they can't talk to those individuals, but you do need one central point of contact, both for timeliness of responses. If they need things, they can go to you, right? If they're asking someone for something and you didn't know about it, that person doesn't give them what they wanted timely, they forgot about it, you're the one who's on the hook within your own organization. So I would have a central point of contact in the verifications to make sure things are going according to plan, you're responsive to requests, et cetera, and you know what's going on. Again, what the key is the process. In the U.S., the auditors are very big on documented process and controls. So they will spend a lot of time on that. Make sure you've documented how you do it. Right? Getting to the answer is important, but how you get there is just as important. If you don't have some type of certificate for a material, don't treat it as originating. Okay? Under any circumstance, just treat it as a non-originating material. It's what the auditors are going to expect. And again, under whichever value test you're doing, build up, build down, make sure you have the support for those values, whether it's a cost base or the price of the goods. The results, hopefully we're all in the first line. Customs does the verification, accepts everything, and everyone's happy. Hopefully that's always the result. Experience tells us it will not be, so there's some other ones. What we've seen, Customs has some recommendations, but the claims are okay. They might want you to tighten up controls a little bit, just has some process recommendations, but they're happy with the claims. Again, that's a pretty good result. If there's a problem, that's when duty bills are issued to the importer. Under the free trade agreements, and we'll see how this works in the U.S. Korea. I know how it works in U.S. In the NAFTA agreement. Exporters can get penalties. Now, the U.S. couldn't issue a Korean exporter a penalty for a bad certificate. They would go to Korean customs and say, here's the results of the audit, and we think you should be issuing a penalty to the exporter. It's provided for in the agreement, and it's provided for in the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. So, and that's kind of how it works. If they think there's a reason for it, they can recommend the other country issue a penalty. It's not normal. They won't do it just because, like going back to that purchasing example, that would not have been a penalty situation. A resourcing of a component is normal. The product didn't qualify. That's normal. But if there was something where, you're not getting origin statements from your vendors and just assuming everything is originating, yeah, you might get a penalty. So there is a process for that. So it's not just the duty liability to the importer. There's also penalties as an exporter and potentially penalties as an importer. With that, we're happy to take questions.